The wild beginnings. The UFC started in 1993 as a wild, no-rules fighting event. It wasn't polished or professional. It was pure chaos. There were no weight classes, no time limits, no gloves, and barely any rules. It was marketed like a real-life version of what if a boxer fought a wrestler? Or what if a karate guy fought a sumo wrestler? The goal was to settle age-old martial arts debates by throwing everyone into a cage and letting them fight. The first event shocked everyone by selling over 86,000 pay-per-views. It looked brutal, and it was. People were getting knocked out cold, tapping out in pain, and bleeding all over the mat. It was raw and exciting, but also scary to many. Senator John McCain famously called it human cockfighting and pushed to get it banned. Soon, most cable companies dropped the UFC. The sport lost sponsors, events got canceled, and public opinion turned negative. Still, the UFC had lit a spark. Even in its roughest form, people saw something real. It wasn't just violence, it was the start of something bigger. If you thought the early UFC was insane, just wait, things only get wilder. Smash that subscribe button and stick around for the madness ahead. The Dark Ages. After the chaos of the early UFC, things started falling apart. With growing public criticism and political pressure, most states refused to host events. Pay-per-view companies backed out, UFC was banned from TV and was losing money fast. These years were called the Dark Ages, and for good reason. The organization tried to fix things. They added weight classes, time limits, gloves, and more rules to make it look like a real sport, but the damage had already been done. Nobody was watching. Nobody cared. By 2001, the UFC was nearly dead. That's when Dana White and childhood friends Lorenzo and Frank Fertitta stepped in. They saw potential where others saw failure. They bought the UFC for just $2 million, basically getting a brand name, a wooden octagon, and a few fighter contracts. That's it. They didn't know much about running a fight promotion, but they had passion, and they believed MMA could be something massive. It was a huge risk. Most people thought they were crazy, but they had one goal: clean up the image, build it like a real sport, and show the world what MMA could really be. The rebuild. With Dana White now president and the Fertitta brothers funding the operation, the UFC began a slow but focused rebuild. They wanted to turn MMA from a banned blood sport into something respected, something real. That meant changing everything. Safer rules, better marketing, proper athletic commissions, and structured events that could be sanctioned by state authorities. But even with all these improvements, fans weren't showing up. The UFC kept bleeding money event after event, loss after loss. They were $44 million in debt, and it looked like the sport might collapse again. So they tried one last move: reality TV. They created The Ultimate Fighter, a new kind of show where fighters lived together, trained together, and fought at the end of each episode. At first, no TV networks wanted it, so the UFC paid $10 million out of pocket to air it for free on Spike TV. It was their last shot. If it failed, the company was finished. But if it worked, it could change everything. The UFC had fixed its rules, now it just needed the world to care, and one fight would decide it all. The Ultimate Fighter era. In 2005, the UFC aired The Ultimate Fighter, a reality show where fighters trained, lived together, and fought for a UFC contract. It was a gamble. The UFC paid $10 million to get it on Spike TV for free. If this didn't work, the company would likely fold. Then came the finale: Forrest Griffin versus Stephan Bonnar. What followed was one of the wildest, most exciting fights in UFC history. No titles, no trash talk, just pure heart. People watching at home started calling friends. Ratings exploded mid-broadcast. Everyone saw what MMA could really be. That fight didn't just entertain, it saved the UFC. Right after the fight, Spike executives met Dana White behind the arena and scribbled out a new deal on a napkin. The UFC had arrived. From there, things exploded. New fans poured in. Pay-per-view numbers started to grow. Fighters like Chuck Liddell, Tito Ortiz, and Randy Couture became stars. For the first time, the UFC wasn't just a niche sport. It was breaking into the mainstream. The rebuild was over. Now the empire was beginning. The Golden Era. By 2009, the UFC had gone from near bankruptcy to a global phenomenon. UFC 100 was a turning point. With stars like Brock Lesnar, Georges St-Pierre, and Dan Henderson, it pulled in 1.6 million pay-per-view buys, a number once thought impossible. It felt like the Super Bowl of fighting. UFC continued to grow by absorbing other promotions. They bought the WEC and later Strikeforce, bringing in lighter weight classes and future stars like John Jones, Daniel Cormier, and Anthony Pettis. For the first time, every division from flyweight to heavyweight was stacked with talent. In 2011, the UFC signed a huge TV deal with Fox. It was no longer just a cable product. It was on national television, reaching millions more viewers. But the golden years weren't perfect. Performance-enhancing drugs were everywhere. TRT was legal, and some fighters looked superhuman. It wasn't until USADA was brought in for drug testing in 2014 that things started to change. Still, this era gave us legendary champions and unforgettable moments. For many fans, this was the UFC at its best. Big names, big fights, and the world finally watching. The Rousey Revolution. For years, Dana White said women would never fight in the UFC. That changed when Ronda Rousey came along. An Olympic judo medalist with a killer armbar and unmatched intensity, Rousey didn't just win, she dominated. Most of her fights ended in under a minute. She wasn't just a fighter, she was a star. She did interviews, movies, late-night TV, and magazine covers. For the first time, a female fighter was the face of the UFC, and fans couldn't get enough. She headlined events, sold out arenas, and brought in massive pay-per-view numbers. Her rise kicked open the door for women in MMA. Fighters like Miesha Tate, Holly Holm, and Joanna Jędrzejczyk followed. Women's divisions were added, and no one questioned whether they belonged again. Rousey changed the way people saw MMA. She showed that greatness wasn't just about power, it was about presence, personality, and proving people wrong. Even after a shocking loss to Holly Holm, her legacy was cemented. She wasn't just a champion, she was a movement. The McGregor era. When Conor McGregor entered the UFC, everything changed. He was loud, confident, and incredibly skilled. He didn't just talk trash, he backed it up with brutal knockouts and fast finishes. His left hand became legendary. In 2015, he knocked out Jose Aldo in just 13 seconds to win the featherweight title. Then he moved up and dominated Eddie Alvarez to become the UFC's first ever two-division champion. Double champ status, history made. But Conor wasn't just winning fights, he was making the UFC richer than ever. He sold more pay-per-views than anyone before him. He made every fight feel like an event in and of itself. Fans who'd never watched MMA tuned in just to see him, a phenomenon. Then came the unthinkable, a boxing match with Floyd Mayweather. It didn't matter that he lost. The hype, the money, and the global spotlight took the UFC to a new level. But his rise also changed the rules. Star power started to matter more than rankings. Fighters who shouted the loudest got the biggest opportunities. McGregor didn't just change the UFC. For better or worse, he became the UFC. The entertainment era. After McGregor's explosion, the UFC leaned fully into entertainment. It wasn't just about who earned title shots anymore. It's about who could sell the most tickets, talk the most trash, and go viral. Fighters like Colby Covington, Jorge Masvidal, and Israel Adesanya rose quickly, not just through wins, but through headlines. The UFC also signed a massive deal with ESPN, moving all its events to America's biggest sports network. This gave the company more exposure and more pressure to deliver big ratings. But behind the scenes, things were shifting. Merit took a back seat. Some fighters were passed over for not being marketable. Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson, one of the most dominant champions ever, was let go simply because he wasn't a big draw. It became clear the UFC had become a business first, sports second. Press conferences were louder, fighters campaigned for money fights. The rankings, often ignored. Titles, sometimes delayed or stripped. It worked financially, but the cost was authenticity. Fans noticed, hardcore purists started to feel left behind. The UFC was no longer just about who the best fighter was, it was about who could entertain the most. The COVID era. When COVID-19 shut down the world in 2020, almost every major sport stopped, but not the UFC. Dana White refused to quit. While leagues like the NBA and NFL paused, the UFC kept moving, building Fight Island in Abu Dhabi and using its own Apex Center in Las Vegas to keep events going. There were no fans, just fighters, coaches, and cameras. Every punch echoed through empty arenas. It was strange, but it worked. The UFC became the only live sport on television. Pay-per-view sales went up while millions of new fans turned in during the lockdown. Fight Island wasn't just a gimmick, it was a lifeline. The Apex Center allowed them to control everything. Travel, testing, production. It became the UFC's home base. Fighters like Jorge Masvidal and Khamzat Chimaev became breakout stars during this time. Fans appreciated the effort. Even in a global crisis, the UFC delivered. But the nonstop schedule had a price. As events piled up, fight quality started to slip. Still, Dana proved one thing: the UFC could survive anything, even in a pandemic. The modern decline. After the pandemic, the UFC kept using its Apex Center for more and more events. At first, it made sense: fewer costs and easier planning. The fans started to get tired. No crowds, no energy, and cards that felt rushed or forgettable. The UFC was producing more content than ever, but not always the best quality. At the same time, pay-per-view prices kept going up while fight quality often went down. Many events lacked star power, and new fighters were signed through Dana White's Contender Series. Exciting, but paid less. Even main events started feeling like filler matches. Big names like Conor McGregor were fading, and the next generation wasn't promoted the same way. Fighters like Alex Pereira and Ilia Topuria are showing promise, but without proper build-up, even their success is feeling a bit quieter. The UFC's also merged with WWE to form the TKO group, and Dana White launched Power Slap, a move that made many fans wonder if fighting had become secondary to social media clicks. The sport definitely feels different. Some say the UFC has lost its soul. Others believe it's just a phase. The UFC has changed, but the fights remain amazing, a true spectacle. Through every era, the UFC continues on. Like, comment, and subscribe if you still believe in the heart of the Octagon.